The morning she found him on her porch with a bullet wound in his shoulder and a confession burning on his lips, Louise Ramsey finally understood that every single cup of coffee had been a love letter she had never known how to read. She stood in the doorway of her modest homestead on the outskirts of Cutter's Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1881, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her rifle aimed squarely at the chest of the man who was bleeding onto her freshly swept floorboards. Tobias Prescott looked up at her with those gray eyes she had learned to distrust, and somehow never could, his shirt soaked dark red, his jaw clenched against a pain that was clearly enormous, and he said 4 words that cracked something open in her chest like a fault line giving way after too many years of strain. "I was protecting you." She did not lower the rifle. "From what?" she demanded, her voice steadier than anything else in the world at that moment, steadier than her hands, steadier than her heartbeat, which had gone wild and reckless the moment she opened the door to find him there. "From Fletcher Kane," he said. "From the truth. From everything I have been carrying since the day I rode into this county and made the worst mistake of my life." The name Fletcher Kane hit her like a fist. She knew that name. She knew it the way a scar knows the knife that made it, deep and permanent and impossible to forget. Fletcher Kane was the man who had burned her father's ranch to the ground 3 years ago. Fletcher Kane was the reason she was alone on this small patch of land, the reason her father lay in the churchyard behind the Baptist chapel in town, the reason she had rebuilt with borrowed money and pure, grinding stubbornness. And Tobias Prescott, the man who had been leaving her fresh coffee on her doorstep every single morning for 7 months without ever explaining why or admitting it was him, apparently worked for Fletcher Kane. Had worked for Fletcher Kane, or still did. She genuinely did not know which, and that uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. "You have exactly 30 seconds, she said, "to start making this make sense, Mr. Prescott, before I decide this rifle has been too patient for too long." He leaned his head back against the doorframe and let out a long breath that rattled in his chest, and she could see the effort it took for him to stay conscious, to stay present, to stay honest in a way she had never quite seen from him before. And somewhere underneath the rage and the fear and the betrayal that was coiling through her like smoke, Louise Ramsey felt the beginning of something she absolutely could not afford to feel. She felt herself believing him. That was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in 3 years. It had started 7 months earlier, in the brittle cold of late February, when Cutter's Creek was half frozen and half starving, and entirely suspicious of strangers. Louise had arrived in town that winter just 18 months before, after the destruction of her family's ranch outside of Santa Fe, carrying almost nothing except a deed to a small parcel of land her father had purchased on speculation years before and left her in his will. The land was 40 acres of decent soil and poor fencing near the southern edge of Cutter's Creek, and it was hers in the way that grief sometimes leaves you things you never expected to need. She had 40 acres, a small timber frame house that needed substantial work, 3 horses, and a determination so fierce it scared people who got too close to it. The town of Cutter's Creek in Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, was not a friendly place in 1881. The Lincoln County War had only technically ended a couple of years before, and the ground was still soaked with its legacy. People there kept to themselves. They measured trust in years, not conversations. They remembered which families had stood on which sides of too many ugly disputes, and they carried those memories in their bones. Louise was an outsider, a woman alone, and that combination made most of the town either patronizing or predatory, and occasionally both at once. She had made a few careful friendships. There was Mabel Greer, who ran the dry goods store and had a laugh that could shake plaster from ceilings. There was Doc Ames, who had set her wrist when she fell from her barn roof in October and never once mentioned it to anyone else in town, which she respected enormously. There was the Navarro family, who ran sheep on the land neighboring her eastern fence line, and traded labor for provisions with her through the winter months with a quiet generosity. She was not equipped to repay in kind, but swore to herself she eventually would. She had no need for a man. She had specifically, deliberately, and with great intentionality decided that she had no need for a man. She had enough difficulty managing the land, managing the money, managing the creeping fear she felt every time she heard a rider coming down the road after dark. She did not have the space or the patience for romantic entanglement, and the few men in Cutter's Creek who had tested that resolve had been dispatched with a directness they had apparently found memorable, because they did not test it twice. The first morning she found the coffee, she thought she was imagining it. She had come out of her front door at the particular hour. She always woke, before the sun was properly up, when the sky was the color of pewter, and the air had that sharp, clean quality that belonged only to early morning in the desert. She had been awake half the night fretting over the fence on the northwest corner of her property, which was failing in a way she could not afford to fix before spring, and she was tired in that specific bone-deep way that comes from worry more than exertion. And there on her step was a tin cup, steam rising from it in a thin, curling thread, dark coffee that smelled like it had been properly made, not just boiled to bitterness the way most people out here managed it. She stood and stared at it for a solid 30 seconds. Then she looked up and down the road in both directions. The road was empty. The nearest neighboring property was the Navarros, a good half-mile east, and the road into town ran north. She looked at the coffee again. She picked it up carefully like it might be a trap, which was not an unreasonable assumption in Lincoln County in 1881, and she sniffed it. It smelled like coffee. Real coffee, good coffee, the kind that cost money and required a grinder and a proper pot rather than just throwing grounds into boiling water. She drank it standing in her doorway, watching the road, and she could not account for it. She asked Mabel Greer the next time she was in town whether anyone had mentioned leaving something at her place. Mabel had frowned and said no, she hadn't heard a thing, and why had someone been bothering her? Louise had said no, just curious, and left it at that. The second morning there was coffee again. Same tin cup, same hour, same impossibility. This time she made a point of waking earlier. She sat at her kitchen window in the dark before dawn, watching the road, watching her porch. She sat there for over an hour, her eyes straining against the dark, her fingers wrapped around her own mug of cold water, and she neither heard nor saw anyone approaching. She went to the door at the usual hour and the coffee was there. It was warm. Whatever had left it had been there within the last 10 minutes at most. She walked off her porch and looked at the ground around the step. The soil was still winter-hard and she was not an experienced tracker, but she thought she could see the faint impression of boots, larger than hers, coming up from the road at an angle that suggested someone had approached from the west rather than directly from the road itself. She was not sure whether to be frightened or grateful, and that ambivalence bothered her more than either feeling alone would have. She brought it up with Doc Ames on her next visit to town, framing it as a curiosity rather than a concern, and the old doctor had looked at her over the tops of his spectacles with an expression that managed to be amused and thoughtful at the same time. "You've got an admirer," he said. "I've got a trespasser," she corrected. "In this county," Doc Ames said, "those two things are sometimes the same." She had not found that particularly reassuring. By the third week, she had started watching more systematically. She had mapped the likely approach routes to her porch. She had scattered a thin line of loose dirt along the most probable path, and she had stayed awake with considerably more discipline. What she had learned was that whoever was doing this was both careful and practiced. They left no sound she could hear. They disturbed nothing she left for them to disturb. They arrived and departed like smoke, and yet every morning, with the reliability of sunrise itself, the coffee was there. She had also learned, through careful observation of the cup and the quality of the grounds and the method of preparation, that whoever was making this coffee had access to good quality beans, ground fine, and prepared with what appeared to be a proper coffee pot. This was not a campfire offering. This was someone who lived in the area, who had a proper kitchen or at minimum a proper kit, and who was putting genuine effort into the quality of what they were leaving. Against her better judgment, she had started to appreciate the quality. She was drinking her fourth consecutive morning's cup of mystery coffee when Tobias Prescott walked into Cutter's Creek. She did not know who he was the first time she saw him. She was at Mabel's store, arguing gently about the price of sugar, when the bell over the door announced a new arrival, and she looked up out of habit to see a man she did not recognize stepping inside. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two more, with the kind of build that comes from real outdoor work rather than any deliberate effort toward it, broad through the shoulders and lean in the way of men who spent more time in the saddle than at tables. His hair was dark, nearly black, and he wore it a little long, just touching his collar. His eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that reminded her of winter sky just before snow. He nodded at Mabel first, which she registered as proper. Then he glanced at Louise with a brief, polite acknowledgement and moved toward the counter with a list he produced from his shirt pocket. Louise looked back at her sugar. She was not interested. She absolutely was not interested. She did notice, somewhat against her will, that his voice was a quiet baritone and that he said please when he gave Mabel his order, which was not universal in Cutter's Creek and consequently stood out. She finished her own purchase and left without making conversation. She had work to do. She saw him twice more in the following week, both times in town. Once outside the livery, where he was talking to the blacksmith about something to do with a horse's shoe with the specific attentiveness of a man who genuinely cared about the animal. Once at the far end of the main street, where he was standing with a group of men she recognized as belonging to the Fletcher Kane outfit, and that was when she felt the first cold prickle of wariness. Fletcher Kane ran cattle on a large spread north of town. He had come into the county about 4 years ago, buying land with money whose origins most people considered it unhealthy to question, and he had expanded his holdings with a combination of legitimate purchase and illegitimate pressure that had become something of an open secret in the county. People were afraid of him. People sold to him when they didn't want to sell, because the alternatives Fletcher Kane could arrange were reliably worse than the transaction. Louise was not afraid of him. She was deeply, carefully wary of him, which was a different and more functional thing, and Tobias Prescott was standing with his men. She filed that information away and did not let herself think about it any further in the way that might lead to conclusions. The coffee continued. By the second month, she had begun to think of it as simply part of her morning, which she recognized was a capitulation of sorts but could not bring herself to reverse. The coffee was good. Her mornings were hard. The cup on the step had become a small anchor to the idea that the day, however it turned out, had started with something unexpectedly kind. She had not stopped trying to identify the source. She had merely begun to approach the mystery with a more measured patience. She watched. She listened. She asked occasional careful questions in town without indicating precisely what she was looking for. In the middle of the third month, she had a partial answer. She had been coming back from the Navarro property after an afternoon of helping with lambing, and she took the long way home that curved past the western edge of the Fletcher Kane range before turning south toward her own land. She was tired and a little muddy and in no mood for anything complicated, which was of course precisely the moment she came around a bend in the road and nearly rode her horse into Tobias Prescott. He was coming from the direction of her land. He pulled his horse up short with the ease of an experienced rider and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Ramsay," he said. She stared at him. "Mr. Prescott." She knew his name by then. Most people in Cutter's Creek knew it by that point. He had taken a foreman position on the Kane Ranch about 6 weeks ago and established himself as competent, quiet, and difficult to get a read on, which was precisely the combination that made men in this county either respected or distrusted, depending on the observer's own history. He was coming from the direction of her land. at 5:15 in the afternoon. She looked at the road behind him, the track that came from her property and nothing else in this particular direction. Then she looked at him. "Were you on my property?" she asked. He held her gaze without flinching. "I was fixing your northwest fence line." The silence that followed was long enough for a hawk to cross the sky overhead. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "That fence is my responsibility." "It is," he said. "It was also falling down in a way that was going to cost you 3 of your horses before winter was properly done with you. I had the materials and the time this afternoon. The fence is fixed." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. He had a quality she had noticed before, an absolute stillness when he chose to be still, like a man who had learned to wait out discomfort rather than fill it with noise. "Thank you," she said finally, because the honest truth was that the fence had been keeping her awake and she did not have the money to hire it fixed, and the materials and the skill required were beyond what she could manage alone in the current season. "You're welcome," he said simply, without either smugness or false modesty. Then she said, "Mr. Prescott, are you leaving coffee on my porch in the mornings?" She watched his face very carefully. There was a fraction of a second barely visible where something shifted in his expression. Not guilt precisely, something more complex than guilt. Something that might have been, if she were being generous, the look of a man deciding whether to be honest about something he had not intended to be found out about. "Yes," he said. The simplicity of it disarmed her completely. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the impression he was choosing his words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. "Because you wake up early," he said at last, "and you work harder than most, and winter out here is harder than it ought to be, and a decent cup of coffee in the morning seemed like the least complicated form of help I could offer without you arguing about accepting it." She stared at him. "You assumed I would argue," she said. "I assumed correctly," he said, and there was something in that gray gaze that might, if the light were different and the context were easier, have been called warm. She did not know what to do with any of this. She was 26 years old and she had been on her own for nearly 3 years, and she had become quite good at knowing what to do with most things, but this, the quiet fixing of her fences and the morning coffee and the honesty of this man who worked for Fletcher Kane and who was looking at her from across a dirt road in the afternoon light as though she were something worth looking at, this was not a category she had prepared for. "Mr. Prescott," she said carefully. "Who do you work for?" "Fletcher Kane," he said. "And you are aware," she said, keeping her voice very even, "that Fletcher Kane is responsible for the death of my father and the destruction of my family's ranch." Something moved across his face. It was not surprise, and the absence of surprise told her a great deal. "I am aware," he said. "Then I would appreciate," she said, "if you would keep yourself off my property and stop leaving things on my doorstep, whatever your intentions are." She put her heels to her horse and rode home without looking back. She lay awake that night and told herself she had done the right thing. She lay awake the morning after that and found the coffee on her step. She stood in her doorway with the cup in both hands and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something infuriating and impossible and inconveniently human. Something that went by various names depending on the kind of story you were living in. And in Louise Ramsey's experience, she was not living in the kind of story where that feeling ended well. She drank the coffee anyway. She told herself she was drinking it because it was good coffee, and wasting it would be foolish. She did not go into town for 2 weeks. When she finally did go, it was out of necessity, needing flour and lamp oil and a new length of rope, and she made it her business to be efficient and unsentimental, and to not look around in that particular way that people look around when they are hoping to see someone specific. She saw him anyway. He was at the far end of the street, talking to one of the Kane Ranch hands, and he did not see her, and she stood outside Mabel's store and observed him for approximately 15 seconds before she made herself go inside. Mabel, who saw everything and forgot nothing and had the investigative instincts of a natural-born detective, took one look at Louise's face and said, "Tobias Prescott." Louise put her list on the counter. "Sugar and flour, please." "He asked about you," Mabel said, beginning to fill the order with the particular efficiency of a woman multitasking between commerce and gossip. "About 2 weeks ago. Nothing intrusive, just whether you were doing all right out there alone, whether the place had been giving you trouble." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you would be deeply offended to know I'd been asked," Mabel said cheerfully. "Which I gathered was the most honest thing I could say." Louise almost smiled. "Thank you. He's not like the others on that cane spread," Mabel said more quietly, her tone dropping to something more serious. "I've been watching people come through this town for 20 years, Louise. He's different. Something about why he's there doesn't sit right with what kind of man he appears to be." Louise took her package. "That's a very delicate way of saying you don't trust him either." "That's a very delicate way," Mabel said, "of saying I think there is more to that story and it might be worth finding out." Louise went home and thought about that. The coffee continued every morning without fail, even through the 3 days in April when it rained sideways, and the roads turned to mud and the wind was cruel. Even then, the cup would be sitting there, protected from the rain by the slight overhang of her porch roof, steam still rising from it, as though whoever left it had some arrangement with the weather itself. She had stopped telling herself she was going to make it stop. She had not stopped asking herself what she was going to do with the soft, persistent feeling that had set up residence somewhere behind her sternum, in spite of every reasonable objection she could name. The next time she spoke to Tobias Prescott, it was because she rode to the fence line deliberately, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April when the desert was starting to smell like spring, and she had been arguing with herself for approximately 3 weeks. He was there. She had known he would be, because she had paid close enough attention to know that he often rode the eastern boundary of the Cane Range on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and that boundary ran parallel to her northwestern corner at a distance of perhaps a quarter-mile. She had told herself she was going to check the fence he had repaired. She checked the fence. It was, as she would have expected based on everything she had observed, solid, well-done work. Better work than she could have managed herself with better materials. She rode to the fence line that divided the properties and waited. He appeared within 10 minutes, and if there was any surprise in his expression when he saw her sitting there, it was well contained. He pulled up on his side of the fence and waited. "You kept leaving the coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. "I told you not to." "You told me to keep off your property and stop leaving things on your doorstep," he said. "I've been leaving it at the edge of your property, technically speaking, just within your fence line on the porch side." She stared at him. "That is an extremely fine distinction." "I am a man who respects clearly stated boundaries," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of something dry and warm in his voice that was absolutely infuriating because it was also entirely charming. "Why do you work for Fletcher Kane?" she asked. She had decided to be direct, because she was always direct, and she was tired of dancing around the thing that mattered most. He was quiet for a moment. The horses stood patient in the spring warmth, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark was expressing itself with great enthusiasm. "Because I needed to be close to him," he said finally. "There are things he has done that he has never answered for. I came to this county to get enough evidence to take to the federal marshal's office. Taking the foreman job was the only way to get close enough to see his books, to hear his conversations, to understand the full extent of what he has been doing." Louise looked at him steadily. "That is either the most noble thing I have heard in years," she said, "or an extremely compelling lie." "I know," he said. "My father died because of Fletcher Kane," she said. Her voice was even. She had learned to say it evenly. "He hired men to drive the ranchers out of the Santa Fe area so he could consolidate the land. My father refused to sell. His ranch was burned with him inside it." She paused. "I'm telling you this so you understand that my tolerance for anything that ends with Fletcher Kane protected and comfortable is exactly nothing." Tobias Prescott looked at her across the fence in the spring afternoon, and she saw something in his face that was not performance, not calculation, not the kind of sympathy people put on like a costume when they wanted something from her. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things. My brother worked for him, he said, on the Santa Fe operation. My brother did not know what he was part of until it was too late, and when he tried to pull back from it, Kane had him killed and made it look like an accident. I have been living with that for 2 years. I came here to make it right. The meadowlark was still singing somewhere in the brush. A cloud drifted across the sun and the afternoon light shifted to something softer. How long, she asked, before you have what you need? Weeks, he said, maybe 2 months. He is getting careless. Men like Kane always get careless when they feel safe, and he feels very safe right now. And then I take everything I have to the federal marshal in Santa Fe and I testify to everything I have witnessed. And I accept whatever consequences come from having spent 18 months in close proximity to a man I was trying to bring down. He held her gaze. There will be consequences. Some people will not understand the distinction between working for someone and working against them. I know that. Louise was quiet for a while. The coffee, she said at last. Yes, he said. Is that also part of some strategy? He looked at her then in a way that was so direct and so unguarded that it briefly stole the steadiness she had been working to maintain. No, he said quietly. That is entirely separate from strategy. That is me being unable to ride past your road in the morning and not think about the fact that you have been out here alone for too long and that you deserve at least one thing that's good without having to fight for it. She rode home with her thoughts in considerable disorder. She told herself she needed time to consider all of this. She told herself she could not afford to trust a man whose primary occupation, by his own admission, was performing a deception. She told herself that even if everything he said was true, the situation was unstable and dangerous, and the kind of thing that ended with people getting hurt, and she had been hurt enough. She drank her coffee the next morning and thought about his brother and about her father and about the strange geometry of grief that could connect two people across all the distance between their separate losses. She went back to the fence line on Thursday. He was there. They talked for an hour, then 2 hours. And then, as April became May and May deepened into the full warmth of a New Mexico summer, she began to look forward to Thursday afternoons at the fence line with a specific anticipation that she eventually stopped trying to pretend was anything other than what it was. She was falling in love with him. She was falling in love with a man who worked for the person responsible for her father's death, who was conducting a dangerous covert operation that could get him killed, who left her coffee every morning before dawn and fixed her fences without being asked and looked at her as though she were something worth being patient for. She was falling in love with him, and it was the most inconvenient, most frightening, and most entirely inevitable thing that had happened to her in 3 years. She did not tell him. She was not a woman who said such things before she was certain. She was not certain. She was afraid of being certain, because certainty in situations like this one could be a very expensive thing. What she did do, in mid-May, was invite him to have coffee with her on her porch rather than through a fence. He arrived at 7 in the morning on the Saturday she had suggested, on a horse that was clearly his own rather than from the Kane stable, and he took off his hat when he came through the gate and sat in the chair she had set out, and they drank coffee together in the morning warmth and talked about entirely ordinary things, the price of cattle and the state of the roads, and a book she had been reading, and it was the most comfortable morning she had spent since before her father died. He came the following Saturday as well, and the one after that. Through June, their Saturday mornings became the scaffolding around which she organized the rest of her week, which she recognized was a significant development in the architecture of her interior life. She began to know things about him, that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had worked cattle from the time he was a boy, that he had 2 years of schooling at a Methodist academy that he credited with giving him a foundational love of reading, even in circumstances where books were not readily available. She knew that he took his coffee with nothing in it, that he had a habit of going quiet rather than filling silence with noise, that he found the landscape of New Mexico territory genuinely beautiful in a way that was not performance, that he laughed rarely but when he did it was a real laugh, unguarded, full. She knew that he missed his brother every day, and that the weight of that loss had reshaped him in ways he was still discovering. She knew he was honest, in the deepest functional sense of the word, the kind of honest that was not comfortable or convenient but was simply constitutive of how he moved through the world. She trusted him. That was the most significant thing. She had not trusted anyone, not completely, not with her own sense of safety and well-being since the night she had received the news about her father. Trust had become something she carefully rationed, assessed, calibrated. She gave it in small, measured increments and watched very carefully to see how it was used. She trusted Tobias Prescott. She had not told him that either. In late June, he told her that he was close, very close. He had documents. He had dates and names and figures from the Kane Ranch's actual books, which told a story that was completely at odds with the story Fletcher Kane told the county and the federal land office. He had testimony from 2 former ranch hands who had left the Kane operation under circumstances that had frightened them into cooperation. He had enough, or very close to enough, and he was planning a trip to Santa Fe to present everything to the federal marshal's office within the next few weeks. Louise had felt a complicated mixture of relief and terror when he told her, because the relief was about justice and the terror was about what came next. What happened to a man who had been inside Fletcher Kane's operation for 18 months when that operation came apart? "He will know it was you," she had said. "Yes," he had said. "You could leave the county before you go to Santa Fe. You could make sure you're well clear of his reach, and leave you here with him still operational," he had said very quietly. "No." She had looked at him across the porch table and thought, "There it is. There is the thing I have been watching for, the proof that what this man is made of is what I think it is made of." She had reached across the table and put her hand over his. He had looked down at their hands and then up at her face, and something had happened in the space between them that was enormous and wordless and the most natural thing she had experienced in years. "Louise," he had said. "I know," she had said. "I need you to know that when this is done, when I have done what I came here to do, and the account is settled as much as it can be settled, what I want is—" He had stopped. He had a rare difficulty with words in that moment, this man who was otherwise so economical and precise with them. "What I want is to find out whether what has been building between us for these months is what I think it is, whether it can become what I would like it to become." "And what would you like it to become?" she had asked. He had looked at her steadily. "Everything," he had said. She had squeezed his hand and not let go for a very long time. That had been 3 weeks before the morning he appeared on her doorstep with a bullet in his shoulder. In between that moment and this one, Fletcher Kane had gotten careless but also, simultaneously, suspicious, and the two things had collided in a way that Tobias had not entirely anticipated. He had been discovered. Not fully, not in a way that revealed the full scope of what he had been doing, but enough. One of the ranch hands he had interviewed had panicked and gone back to Kane with fragments of the story, enough fragments to make Kane paranoid and dangerous and specific in a way that was new. Kane had set a trap. He had left what appeared to be the final piece of evidence Tobias needed in a place where it was easily accessible, and when Tobias went to collect it, 2 of Kane's men had been waiting. Tobias had gotten away, but not unscathed, and he had not gone back to the ranch, and he had not gone anywhere except to the one place he trusted more than any other place he knew. He had come to Louise. Now he was on her porch step with a bullet in his shoulder, and the whole shape of the situation had become acutely clear, and Louise Ramsey stood in her doorway with her rifle, and made a decision that felt less like a choice than like the acknowledgement of something that had already been decided, somewhere deeper than the place where conscious choices were made. She lowered the rifle. "Get inside," she said. She cleaned the wound with the careful competence of a woman who had lived frontier life long enough to know basic field medicine. And Tobias was quiet through the process, in that particular way of men who have learned that making noise about pain doesn't reduce it. She dug the bullet out with instruments that had belonged to her father and were clean and good, and she packed and bandaged the wound with strips of cloth she had ready for emergencies. And when she was done, she made him lie down on the narrow bed in the room that had been her father's, and she sat beside him and made herself say the thing she had been working toward for months. "I love you," she said. "I am telling you now because I think this is probably the moment when that information matters most, and because I have a habit of waiting for perfect conditions, and there are no perfect conditions out here and there never have been." He looked up at her from the pillow with those gray eyes that were slightly glassy with pain and completely clear with the specific brightness of a man receiving exactly what he most wanted. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning you looked at that first cup of coffee like it might be a weapon. The look on your face was the most thoroughly you thing I had ever seen, and I had known you for approximately 30 seconds. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, which was increasingly how she knew something was genuinely funny. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need to get to Santa Fe," he said. "Everything I have collected is in my saddlebag." "If Kane finds it before I can get it to the marshal, I know," she said. "But you cannot ride to Santa Fe with a fresh bullet wound, and you know it. We have time to be strategic." "Louise, we have time," she repeated with a firmness that allowed no reasonable counterargument. "Sleep. I am going to think." She sat at her kitchen table that evening and did her thinking, and the shape of it was as follows. Tobias could not ride in his current condition. She could ride. She could also, as it happened, be quite persuasive when she needed to be. She had spent 3 years building a quiet, careful understanding of who in this county could be trusted and who could not, and she had been storing that information like firewood for an emergency she could see was eventually coming. The Navarro family had a son, Marco, who had worked as a courier for the territorial government's mail service, and who was discreet, reliable, and deeply personally antagonistic toward Fletcher Kane, whose fence expansion had twice cut across traditional Navarro grazing routes. Marco Navarro could get a message to Doc Ames, who had a relationship with the federal marshal's office from his time as a contract surgeon for the territorial government, and Doc Ames could begin making the arrangements in Santa Fe while Louise figured out how to keep Tobias alive and hidden long enough for those arrangements to take effect. It was a workable plan. It was not a comfortable plan, but comfortable had not been on the menu for quite some time. She went and looked in at Tobias, who had fallen into the deep sleep of exhaustion and blood loss, and she stood in the doorway for a moment watching him breathe, and she allowed herself, just briefly, to feel the full weight of how much she could not afford to lose him, and then she set that aside because feeling it was not helpful and acting was. She rode to the Navarros before sunrise. Marco Navarro was a tall, serious young man of 22 with his mother's eyes and his father's determination. And when Louise explained the situation to him at the kitchen table of the Navarro house while his parents listened quietly, he had not flinched or hedged. He had asked 2 precise questions about the documentation and the marshal's contact in Santa Fe, and then he had said he would ride that morning. She had squeezed Elena Navarro's hand in gratitude on the way out, and Elena had said quietly, "He has been watching out for you for months, that man. We have noticed. A good man watches that way." Louise had driven back to her homestead with the sky just going pink and found Tobias awake and sitting up and looking more alert than anyone with a fresh bullet wound had any right to. "You've been out," he said. "I've been solving the problem," she said, "which is what I do." She told him about Marco Navarro. He listened carefully and then said, "That will work. But Louise, you need to understand that when Kane figures out where I went, which he will because he is not stupid, this property becomes a target." "This property has been a target since I moved onto it," she said. "Fletcher Kane has sent 2 men by to discuss selling in the last year, and I sent both of them back with clear answers. He knows I won't sell, and he knows I know what he did to my father. He was eventually going to come for this place regardless. The only question is whether when he does it, we are in a position of advantage or disadvantage." Tobias looked at her for a long moment. "You have been thinking about this for a long time," he said. "Since the first week I moved here," she said. "I always knew it would come to something. I just didn't know what form it would take." "And you're not frightened?" She met his eyes. "I am terrified," she said. "But I have found that being terrified and being effective are not mutually exclusive." He reached out and took her hand, and despite the circumstances she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. Marco Navarro rode for Santa Fe that morning. They had perhaps 4 days before Fletcher Kane made a serious move, by Tobias's estimate. Maybe 5 if they were fortunate. The federal marshal's office. If Doc Ames managed to make contact quickly, and if the marshal took the situation at the seriousness it warranted, could have men in Cutter's Creek within 3 days of receiving the documentation. That was a tight window, but it was a real one. During those days, something shifted between Louise and Tobias in the unhurried way that significant things sometimes shift, when there is nothing to do but wait and talk and be honest about things that would otherwise have been deferred indefinitely. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his mother who had died when he was 12, and his father who had worked himself into an early grave trying to keep the family farm solvent, about his brother James who had been the kind of person who trusted everyone and saw the best in situations right up until a situation came along that punished him for it. He told her about the 2 years he had spent tracking Fletcher Kane across 3 territories, following the cold trail of a man who destroyed things and moved on and left other people to account for the wreckage. He told her about the loneliness of the work, the isolation of performing a deception he couldn't explain to anyone. Louise told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the night she got the news about her father, how she had been at a friend's house in Santa Fe for dinner, and a rider had come to the door, and she had known from the look on his face before he opened his mouth. She told him about the months after, the grinding practical grief of dismantling a life while also having to construct a new one, about the fear she had lived with that had never quite left but had slowly become something she could function alongside rather than something that consumed her. She told him that the thing she was most proud of about herself was that she had kept going, not heroically, not without cost, but persistently, stubbornly, getting up each day and doing the next necessary thing. "That's not a small thing," Tobias said. "That's the whole thing, actually." "I had a great deal of good coffee to help me," she said. He laughed, and she felt the warmth of it settle in her chest like something coming home. On the 3rd day, Mabel Greer appeared at her gate in the mid-afternoon, which was unusual enough to be significant. Mabel was not a woman who made social calls to outlying properties without reason. Louise came out to meet her, and Mabel, without preamble, said that there were men from the Kane Ranch asking questions in town about Tobias Prescott's whereabouts, and one of them had been asking questions about Louise specifically, about whether she had been seen in town recently or whether anyone had observed unusual activity at her property. "They know," Louise said. "They suspect," Mabel said. "There's a difference, but it's not a comfortable one." Louise thought quickly. "Is there anyone at the marshal's local office who you trust?" Mabel considered. The Lincoln County town of White Oaks had a deputy marshal's office that maintained tenuous jurisdiction over this part of the territory. The deputy there was a man named Holloway, who was new enough to the position to still be motivated and experienced enough to know what motivated men looked like. Mabel had had occasion to form an opinion of him in the last 6 months, and her opinion was cautiously positive. "Holloway," Mabel said. "He's not in Kane's pocket. I would have heard if he was. Can you ride to him today?" "I can ride to him right now," Mabel said, with the decisive simplicity of someone who had been waiting for something useful to do. Louise sent her with a brief written account of what Tobias had gathered against Kane and the outline of where the full documentation had gone. It was enough for a deputy marshal to act on. or it should be. The night of the fourth day was the hardest. Tobias was healing faster than was strictly reasonable, which Louise attributed partly to his constitution and partly to the fact that he was motivated in a very direct way to recover. He was up and moving, carefully, by the second day, and by the fourth he was well enough to be fully present in the planning and alert enough to be realistically useful if events required it. They sat together on the porch that evening in the last of the light, not talking much, the kind of comfortable silence that accumulates between people who have said enough important things to each other that silence stops being empty. Louise had her rifle across her knees. Tobias had his own sidearm, cleaned and loaded. The road was empty in both directions, and the desert was going gold and then purple in the evening light, and it was achingly beautiful and achingly tense at the same time. "When this is over," he said. "When this is over," she agreed, knowing where the sentence was going. "I want to stay," he said, "in this county, near this land, if that is something you—" "Yes," she said. She said it before he finished the sentence because she did not need him to finish it. "Yes, I want that." He looked at her sideways in the fading light, and the expression on his face was the kind that people spend whole lifetimes looking for. "I don't have much," he said. 2 years of undercover work for a case that won't pay me anything. A horse, a kit, some savings that won't buy much land. I have 40 acres and a house that needs work," she said. "Between us, that's a start." "It is a start," he said quietly. "Yes." The riders came the next morning at dawn, which was the kind of timing that suggested planning rather than impulse. There were 4 of them, and they came down the road from the north without particular stealth, which itself was a kind of threat, the confidence of men who believed they had the advantage. Louise was already awake. She was always already awake. She watched them come from her kitchen window, and then she went to the bedroom doorway and said, simply, "They're here." Tobias was on his feet in 30 seconds. The thing that prevented the morning from becoming catastrophic was the arrival, approximately 20 minutes earlier than Louise had any right to expect, of Deputy Marshal Holloway and 2 of his men, who had ridden through the night from White Oaks and who appeared at the southern end of the road at almost exactly the moment the Kane riders appeared from the north. The intersection of those 2 arrivals created a situation that even Fletcher Kane's men, who were more accustomed to operating without legal impediment than with it, could recognize as fundamentally changed. Holloway was a compact, direct man in his mid-30s, with the bearing of someone who had made up his mind about this situation before he arrived and needed only the formality of the confrontation to confirm it. He had received not only Mabel's account, but also, through a telegraph connection from Doc Ames in Santa Fe, a preliminary communication from the federal marshal's office, indicating that Marco Navarro had arrived with the documentation and that an investigation was formally underway. Fletcher Kane's men, facing a deputy marshal with federal backing and a property with 2 armed and prepared inhabitants, made the calculation that most men make when the arithmetic turns against them. They left. Holloway took a statement from Tobias that morning, sitting at Louise's kitchen table, drinking her coffee, and when he rode back to White Oaks, he took with him enough to hold Fletcher Kane in legal jeopardy until the federal marshals arrived the following week. Fletcher Kane was arrested 11 days later at his own ranch house by 3 federal marshals from Santa Fe, acting on the full documentation that Tobias had spent 18 months assembling. He was charged with land fraud, arson, and conspiracy in connection with the deaths of multiple individuals, including Louise's father, across 3 territories. The charges were substantial. The evidence was overwhelming. Louise stood on her porch the morning of the arrest and drank her coffee and watched the sun come up over the desert and felt something she had not felt in 3 years. She felt safe. She felt something else as well, something warm and certain, and so present it was almost tangible, and she turned to find Tobias standing behind her, having come out from the house quietly in the way that was habitual to him, and he was looking at her with an expression of such uncomplicated love that it occurred to her, not for the first time but more clearly than ever before, that this man had been the most consistent presence in her mornings for months before she even knew his name. "It's over," she said. "The dangerous part," he agreed. "The rest of it is just living. I've always been fairly good at that," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." She turned fully toward him, and he took the 2 steps between them and kissed her, there in the morning light on her porch, the coffee cup still warm in their hands and the desert stretching out golden and enormous around them. It was the kind of kiss that belongs to the mornings after the danger has passed, the kind that contains within it not just the present moment, but the acknowledgement of everything that made the present moment possible, all the fear and the patience, and the small persistent acts of care that had been building toward this since a February morning when a woman opened her door to find something unexpectedly kind on her step. She pulled back and looked at him. "Stay," she said, not as an invitation, as something more fundamental than an invitation. "Yes," he said, the same simplicity, the same absolute certainty. The following months had the particular quality of happiness that comes after great difficulty, a happiness that is aware of its own value, because it knows precisely what it cost. They worked the land together through the rest of the summer and into the fall, the 40 acres that had been Louise's alone becoming gradually something shared, something built on and into together. Tobias rode into White Oaks in September and came back with a small document and a quiet expression, and stood at her kitchen door and said, "I spoke to the Reverend. He said he can marry us on Saturday if we want." Louise put down the dough she had been working. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring quality she still had, the one that had once assessed everything as potential danger and now assessed things as potential good. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." They were married on a Saturday morning in early October, 1881, in the parlor of Reverend Aldridge's house in Cutter's Creek, with Mabel Greer and Doc Ames and Alina and Marco Navarro as witnesses. And it was a small ceremony in every external way and enormously full in every way that mattered. Louise wore a dress of deep blue that Mabel had helped her alter from something her mother had left her, and Tobias wore his cleanest clothes and looked at her when she came into the parlor with an expression that Mabel would later describe, correctly, as the look of a man who has found the thing he had stopped believing he would find. Afterward they ate together at Mabel's table, and there were toasts and laughter, and Marco Navarro played a guitar with genuine skill, and the evening went on for a long, warm time. And when Louise and Tobias rode home under the stars to their 40 acres and their house that needed work, they were the kind of tired that comes from too much happiness, which is the best kind. That winter they enlarged the house, adding a proper second room and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front of the house, and they did it mostly themselves with some assistance from the Navarros and a carpenter from town. The work had the texture of something they were building toward rather than something they were doing out of necessity, which was a distinction that made the cold mornings and the tired evenings feel entirely different from the way they had felt when Louise was building alone. Fletcher Kane went a trial in Santa Fe in January of 1882. Tobias testified for 3 days. Louise went with him and sat in the gallery and watched the full accounting of what Fletcher Kane had done laid out in legal daylight, and it was brutal and clarifying and long overdue. The verdict was guilty on the principal charges. The sentencing was severe. Fletcher Kane would go to the federal penitentiary, and he would not be coming back to Lincoln County. The night after the verdict, sitting in the small hotel room in Santa Fe, Louise had cried for the first time in years. Not from grief, exactly, or not only from grief. From the release of something she had been holding for 3 years, the particular tension of a wrong that had not yet been answered, the weight of a thing left unresolved. She cried, and Tobias held her and said nothing because he understood, better than almost anyone, what it was to carry that specific weight and what it cost to finally put it down. She fell asleep with her head against his shoulder, and slept without dreams for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. In the spring of 1882, they planted their first real crop together, expanding what had been a kitchen garden into something more intentional, rows of corn and beans and squash that caught the April sun and grew with the particular enthusiasm of things that had been properly tended. Louise had always had a sense for growing things. Tobias had grown up working land and knew the practical mechanics of it in his bones. Between them, they made a team that was efficient in the way of people whose strengths are naturally complementary. The Kane Ranch was broken up and sold to several different buyers by the court, and two of those buyers were men of the kind who actually worked their own land, which was better for the county than the single consolidated operation had been. The atmosphere in Cutter's Creek shifted perceptibly over the course of that year, something that had been held under pressure slowly normalizing, people talking more openly about things they had been afraid to discuss, while Kane was a functional threat. Doc Ames mentioned at the end of summer that he had been seeing improvements in the general mood of the whole county, and attributed it partly to better conditions and partly to what he called the effect of justice being visible. Louise thought he was right about both. She was, by August, in the early stages of being pregnant with their first child. She told Tobias on a Tuesday morning, on the porch, in the particular hour she had always loved, with the coffee between them and the light coming up golden over the desert, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that she wished she could have preserved and kept. The initial stillness, then the sudden complete unguarded joy, then something quieter and deeper that was the look of a man recalculating the future in the best possible direction. He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair and took both her hands and said, "Louise," in a voice that had so much in it that it barely needed to be a full sentence. "I know," she said. "I know." Their son was born in March of 1883, a fact that made the March landscape of New Mexico Territory permanently and unreasonably beautiful in Louise's memory ever after. They named him James, for Tobias's brother, and the naming had the quality of an accounting completed, a debt of love paid forward to a person who was no longer there to receive it in person, but whose absence had shaped everything that led to this moment. James Prescott was a loud and vigorous baby who expressed opinions about most things with great conviction from approximately his fourth day of life, which Louise found enormously funny and Tobias found entirely expected. "He comes by it honestly," Tobias said, watching his son conduct a vociferous debate with the ceiling. "Both sides of him are stubborn." "I prefer the word principled," Louise said. Mabel Greer was the kind of honorary grandmother who appeared regularly and loudly, and bearing gifts of impractical but delightful variety. And Alina Navarro quietly taught Louise the things about caring for a small child that nobody told you, and that made the whole enterprise considerably more manageable once you knew them. And Doc Ames visited with the frequency of a man who had found a good reason to make the ride out south of town. Tobias had by this point established himself as an independent rancher in a small but functional way, having purchased an additional 20 acres adjacent to their existing property, with the savings from his years of investigation work, and a modest loan from a bank in White Oaks, whose manager was one of the few people Tobias had confided in about the nature of his work for the Kane operation. The 60 acres total gave them room to expand their cattle herd and their crop land, and they were, by any reasonable measure, building something real. It was not an easy life. The life of a small ranching family in New Mexico Territory in the early 1880s was one of constant labor and periodic crisis, and the particular frontier resilience that comes from knowing that nearly everything you have depends on your own capacity and judgment. They had good years and difficult years. They had a season when the rain failed, and the corn crop came in thin, and they had to sell 2 of their best horses to make the year's accounts balance. They had a year when the cattle prices were strong, and they were able to fix the barn and add a proper cistern, and for the first time in Louise's memory, the property felt genuinely secure. Through all of it, the thing that remained constant was the particular quality of their partnership. They were not a couple who agreed on everything or who performed harmony at the expense of honesty. They disagreed, sometimes sharply, about land management and finances, and the raising of their son and various other matters of domestic and professional importance. But their disagreements had the character of two people working toward the same thing, and neither of them had ever, in Louise's experience, used a disagreement as an opportunity to diminish the other. She had not known, before Tobias, that a partnership could feel like this. She had observed enough marriages in her life to know that many of them operated on a different principle, one in which the power was distributed unevenly, and the daily texture of life reflected that imbalance in ways large and small. She had told herself before she met him that this was simply the nature of such arrangements, that one made the best calculation one could and accepted the terms. She had not known it was possible to find something that felt this much like equality, this much like mutual respect made daily and physical and real. She told him this once, on an evening in the summer of their second year after James was born, sitting on the wide porch they had built together watching their son toddle in the yard with a determination that was recognizably his father's and a general attitude of gleeful chaos that was, Louise felt, a fair representation of her own relationship with convention. Tobias had listened to her say this, and then he had said, "I had a template, from watching my parents before things got hard. My mother was a person of considerable force, and my father thought the world of her for it. He never once suggested she should be smaller than she was." He paused. "I always knew that was what I wanted. I just had to find the person." "You found her by leaving coffee on her step and not telling her about it," she said. "The indirect approach has its merits," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder and watched James make his authoritative way toward a particularly interesting rock, and the evening was warm and the desert smelled of sage, and everything was, in that moment, exactly right. In the fall of 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, for no person in particular but for the quality of the name itself, which Louise had always found clean and strong, a name that could carry weight. Clara Prescott was a smaller and quieter baby than her brother had been, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from very early on she had a watchfulness that suggested she was cataloging everything and would have opinions about it later. James was 2.5 by then, and took his role as older brother with the seriousness of a child who has been told something important. He brought Clara rocks, which she could not yet use, and Louise found this so purely characteristic of her son that she described it to Mabel with helpless affection. Cutter's Creek had changed considerably by the mid-1880s. It was not a large town, but it had grown and stabilized in the way of frontier communities that outlast the violence of their founding years and begin to accumulate the slower structures of permanence. There was a proper school now, a 2-room affair that had been built through community subscription and staffed by a teacher who had come from Ohio with qualifications and an admirable tolerance for the particular challenges of frontier education. There were 2 churches and a small hotel and a bank branch, and a doctor's office that Doc Ames operated with the assistance of a younger doctor, who had arrived from St. Louis with enthusiasm and equipment. Louise was involved in the school's founding in a practical way, having been one of the more persistent voices for its establishment, and having contributed both money and considerable organizational energy to getting the building built. Tobias had served 1 term on the county council, which he had found largely satisfying in its specifics and somewhat maddening in its processes, and had declined a 2nd term in favor of the opinion that other people should also have the opportunity to find it maddening. They were, in the language of the community they had built around themselves, good people. The kind of people whose presence in a place made it incrementally better by their being in it, which is the only kind of distinction that Louise had ever found worth having. Marco Navarro had married a woman from a neighboring county in 1884, a forthright and practical person named Dolores, who immediately became part of the wider circle of people who gathered regularly at the Prescott table for meals that went long, and conversations that covered everything from cattle prices to territorial politics to the considerable shared project of raising children in a place that was still finding its shape. The two families were enmeshed in the way of people who have been through significant things together and found each other trustworthy in those things, which creates a bond that ordinary time and circumstance cannot easily dissolve. Doc Ames retired from active practice in 1886 and stayed in Cutter's Creek because, as he said, he had lived here long enough that leaving would be a kind of personal defeat, and he was not prepared for personal defeat at his age. He still came to dinner at the Prescott house regularly, and he and Tobias had developed a habit of playing chess on Sunday afternoons that both of them took with great seriousness and good humor. Mabel Greer sold her store in 1887 to a young couple from Texas who ran it with competence and different biscuit suppliers, which Mabel felt strongly about but accepted with grace. Louise and Tobias planted new trees along the southern fence of their property in the spring of 1887, cottonwoods that would take years to reach their full size but would eventually provide shade and permanence, and the particular beauty of things that have been planted for the future rather than the present. Tobias dug each hole and Louise set each tree, and their children played nearby, and the whole thing took most of a Saturday morning, and felt like the most important thing they had done in months. James was 4 by then and already had strong opinions about horses, inheriting his father's attentiveness to animals in full. Clara was almost 2 and had learned to walk with a confidence that suggested she had considered the matter carefully and decided it was worth attempting. Watching them together, James showing his sister things with a patience that surprised Louise in its consistency, she felt the particular fullness that is not happiness exactly, because happiness is a momentary thing, but is closer to a sustained form of gratitude for the specific shape of one's own life. She turned to Tobias, who was tamping soil around the base of the last cottonwood with practiced care, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up. "Every morning when I drank that coffee," she said, "before I knew it was you, it was the one thing that made me feel like the world had some kindness in it. I want you to know that. I want you to know that before I knew your name or your face or anything about you. What you were giving me was the evidence that there was something good operating in the world, and I held on to that harder than I knew." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the spring morning with the trees newly planted around them, and their children playing in the dirt, and everything they had built visible in all directions. "I want you to know," he said, "that every morning I left that coffee was a morning I was one day further into something that was going to define the rest of my life, and the part that kept me going was not the work or the justice or any of the things I told myself it was about. It was the thought that there was a woman on this road who was fighting for something real, who deserved to have someone fighting for it alongside her, and maybe, if I was very fortunate, that was something I could eventually earn the right to say out loud." She crossed the few feet between them and put her arms around him, and he held her in the spring morning with the smell of turned earth around them and the sound of their children playing nearby and all 60 acres of their shared life stretching outward in every direction. "You earned it," she said into his shoulder, "a long time ago." "I know," he said. "I've been very lucky." "We've been very lucky," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt it the way she felt everything about him, completely and without reservation, the way she had slowly, stubbornly, wonderfully learned to. The cottonwoods grew. The years had a rhythm that was demanding and full and exactly right in the way that lives built on genuine foundation tend to be. James started school in 1887, and turned out to have his mother's facility with books and his father's quietness in rooms full of people, and a specific gift for mathematics that the teacher noted within his first month. Clara, when she was old enough, had her father's eye for the land and her mother's directness in expressing opinions, and she and James argued with the affectionate ferocity of siblings who genuinely liked each other and would die before admitting it. In 1889, the territory of New Mexico was advancing toward statehood, and the political conversations in Cutter's Creek, as across the territory, had a heightened quality. Tobias had maintained his connection to the federal marshal's office from the years of the Kane investigation, and that connection occasionally made him useful in situations that required someone who understood both the legal structure and the practical reality of the territory. And he served in this informal capacity with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. There was a moment, late in that year, when a legal dispute over water rights threatened to revive some of the uglier dynamics of the Lincoln County past, and Louise watched her husband navigate the complexity of it, sitting across from men who disagreed fiercely, speaking carefully and listening more than he spoke, and finding the resolution that everyone else had decided was not there. She watched this and thought, not for the first time, about the remarkable luck of the specific nature of the man she had married, the ways in which his particular character was precisely and continuously useful to the specific life they were living. She mentioned this to him that night. He said that he thought the same about her regularly and considerably more often than she probably realized. She had long since stopped being surprised by the things he said, and had never stopped being moved by them, which seemed to her the right ratio. In the last days of December 1889, Louise found herself sitting at the kitchen table in the house that had been rebuilt and expanded twice from the small structure she had arrived at years ago, drinking the coffee that Tobias had made before anyone else was up, watching the winter light come through the window that now faced a yard where two children would shortly appear demanding breakfast and opinions, and she thought about the sum of what her life had become. She thought about the morning she had first found the cup on her step, the bewilderment and the suspicion, and the involuntary gladness of it. She thought about the fence line and the Thursday afternoons, and the first time she had told him the truth about her feelings. She thought about the bullet wound, and the morning the Kane riders came, and the relief of the arrest and the verdict, and all the ordinary extraordinary things that had followed. She thought about two children sleeping in their beds, and a man who had come from a great distance and a dark purpose, and had somehow become the most constant and sustaining presence in the landscape of her days. The door from the bedroom opened and Tobias appeared, hair still rumpled from sleep, pausing in the doorway to look at her in the way he had, the way that still, after all these years, had the quality of someone choosing to look rather than just seeing. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. "I know," he said, moving to the stove to heat water for a fresh cup. "I was going to bring you coffee." "I made it myself this morning," she said. He turned and looked at her with that particular expression she loved, the one that was not quite a smile but held everything a smile could hold. "Old habits," he said. "Old habits," she agreed. He came and sat beside her, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat together in the early morning quiet with the coffee warming their hands and the light slowly changing in the window, and the sound of the house around them, the small noises of a settled life, the creak of the floor above where James was beginning to stir, the particular silence from Clara's room that meant she was awake but reading, which she did every morning with her mother's complete absorption. Outside, the desert was going from gray to gold. The cottonwoods they had planted along the southern fence were visible through the window, taller now, their winter-bare branches carrying the particular dignity of things that have grown steadily and without fuss. Beyond them, the land stretched out to the horizon, 60 acres of soil they had turned and tended and argued over and celebrated, acres that bore the marks of their shared labor in every fence post and furrow. Louise looked at all of it and felt the weight of it and the lightness of it simultaneously, The way you feel the full value of something that you know you have because you know precisely what its absence would mean. "I love you," she said. He took her hand on the table between them. "I love you," he said. From upstairs, James descended with the determined thump of a 7-year-old boy who has decided that morning has gone on long enough without his participation. And Clara's door opened with the precise quietness of a 4-year-old who believes she is being discreet, and the kitchen filled with the noise and motion of a morning in full. And Louise Prescott, who had been Louise Ramsey when she arrived alone on 40 acres with nothing but stubbornness and grief, and the surprise of an unexplained coffee cup, held all of it and knew it for what it was. It was everything. It was the whole extraordinary sum of a life that had been built, cup by cup and day by day and choice by choice, from something broken into something irreplaceable. And the man sitting beside her with his coffee and his morning hair and his absolute steadiness had been part of it since before she knew his name, since the first dark February morning when she had opened her door to find something she didn't ask for and couldn't account for and came in time. To understand was the first sentence of the best story she would ever live. The sun came fully up over the desert. The day began.